Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of this lecture. In this video, we're going to discuss the 3 major guidelines for modern social science research, and we're going to talk about the federal law known as the Common Rule that codifies those guidelines. In the previous lecture, we discussed some of the major unethical research studies that have helped shape our modern research ethics. Today, social science researchers follow 3 major guidelines. First, voluntary participation. Second, assessment of risk and benefits. And third, fair and equal distribution and selections of subjects. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, but I want to look at the term voluntary participation more in depth right now. Voluntary participation means that the participant should participate in the study as a result of their own free will. Also important is what we call informed consent, meaning that the participant must know exactly what being part of the study entails before he or she can give voluntary consent to participate. The diagram here shows you some of the requirements for informed consent. Participants should be informed about the risks and the benefits of the study, the nature of the research itself, the alternatives that they have for treatment, and they must be given an opportunity for questions. This type of guideline ensures that experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis study cannot occur again, because participants will know the truth of the experiment before it starts. There are some situations in which informed consent is not possible. For example, psychology experiments often require some form of deception. Milgram's experiment wouldn't have worked if he told the participants he was researching or what he was researching at the beginning. In that case, informed consent is not possible at the beginning of the research study. So the researcher must agree to provide the participant with as much information as they can provide without negatively impacting the study. And then they must agree to brief the participants after the study concludes. During the briefing, the researcher will then explain the actual purpose of the research to the participants. They'll give them a chance to ask questions about the study, and they'll provide support resources as necessary for any participants who experienced emotional or physical harm during the experiment. The importance of consent is highlighted here with an example from my own research. In order to truly understand what they're agreeing to, consent forms have to be written with the participants' level of education, their language development, and other relevant personal characteristics in mind. A research study that I did with Dr. Jennifer Klein included both adult and adolescent participants. To ensure that all juveniles in the study understood what was required for participation in the study, we had to use different language in the consent form for juveniles. You can see here from the wording that both wordings reflect the same meaning, but the juvenile form is written at a lower reading level so that juvenile participants can understand what is expected from them. Now let's move to the next area of focus, the assessment of risks and benefits. This process corresponds with the concept of beneficence, which is a requirement of the Belmont report that we discussed previously. Again, summarizing, beneficence means that the researcher should minimize the risks and maximize the benefits. And you can see that in this image here. If you imagine risks and benefits as a teeter-totter, you want to ensure that the benefits always outweigh the risks. The more inequality between the two sides, the better. At worst, you want the risks to equal the benefits, but you should never conduct a study in which the risks are serious and the benefits are limited. The reason that the assessment of risks and benefits does not require the avoidance of all risk is because sometimes harm to the participant can't be avoided. Consider medical studies. When you're trying to identify a cure for cancer, you can do all the pre-research studying possible, and you can still wind up with a drug treatment that has risks. However, the benefit of curing cancer is significant. So as long as the risk is minimized for the participant, and so long as they voluntarily consent to participate in the research study knowing that there is a risk, the assessment process helps reduce the potential for harm. Finally, studies must also maintain a fair selection and distribution of subjects. That means that researchers need to consider their study recruitment methods to determine who's being recruited for the research and who's benefiting from the research. Is recruitment localized to one area or one group in particular? Is recruitment focused on one particular minority or disadvantaged population? Is there a reason for that? If you're exposing subjects to potential risks, you must also ensure that the risks are distributed fairly across anybody who would benefit from the research. To that end, researchers must also consider the use of incentives. Are there money or other incentives involved in the recruitment process? Financial incentives can change the equality of a research because disadvantaged populations may be more incentivized to participate in research compared to advantaged populations. So researchers should carefully consider potentially disadvantaged persons in the study and think about how their recruitment efforts will affect these populations. In addition to the recruitment process, researchers must also consider what happens to the subjects once they're in the study. Are participants distributed fairly between the treatment groups? If a medical group includes a potential new drug and a placebo that doesn't actually do anything, you want to make sure that both groups are relatively similar. You don't want to give the new drug to all the young participants and the placebo to all the old participants. Not only is this a bad research design, but it also means that the risks and the benefits of the study are not being imposed equally on all participants. Out of concern for fair and equal treatment, there are protected classes of persons that we call vulnerable populations. Vulnerable subjects are research participants that, due to a specific characteristic, may be at more risk for ethical violations than other populations. The federal policy for the protection of human subjects lists 3 groups specifically: pregnant women and fetuses, prisoners, and juveniles. Research that uses any of these groups must include special protections because of the vulnerability of their subjects. For example, research using prisoners must go through more extensive review of the recruitment procedures because there's a significant concern about subject coercion due to their incarcerated status. If you were on probation and your probation officer asked you to complete a survey, would you feel like you had a choice? Or would you feel like your probation sentence was in danger if you refused? Although these 3 groups are the only ones actually listed in the federal policy for the protection of human subjects, there are a lot of other populations that are considered vulnerable by researchers. These populations include mentally ill, elderly individuals, as well as disadvantaged populations, students, and veterans. All of these groups can lack the capacity to give informed consent, or they may be more likely or not likely to give consent based on different circumstances. For instance, studies involving college students can be unethical if they require participation in the research study as part of a course. Without an alternative assignment, students face either failing the assignment or participating in the research, and that's not going to be considered a voluntary choice. Another concern with potentially vulnerable populations is research incentives. So again, thinking about that fair and equal distribution. If you were asked to participate in a research study for $10, would you do it? What are the implications for your life if you turn it down? Now consider the same research invitation, but this time you're homeless and you don't have money for food. Do you have the same choice to participate for that $10? Technically, yes, but the different context means that there are very different implications for your life. These differing implications may create feelings of being forced or coerced into a research project. Researchers must provide extra protection for vulnerable populations during subject recruitment to ensure that all participants are participating on a voluntary and informed basis. When you're moving through these first 3 steps, it's important to consider the ethical ramification of your study. In social science, we are usually working with human subjects, meaning that we're working with someone who is a living, breathing person. That means that our research is likely to go through an institutional review board, or IRB. The function of an IRB has been standardized through the Federal Policy for the Protections of Human Subjects, a policy that was heavily influenced by the principles of the Belmont Report. Remember that the Belmont Report was the product of a federal workforce in response to the Tuskegee syphilis study and other questionable research in the United States, and it called for 3 ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects includes 5 parts. Part A is called the Common Rule. This part provides the basic framework for human subject research, including the role of the IRB in the research review process and guidelines for informed consent. Part B through D deals with the vulnerable populations that I just described, and Part E explains the registration process of institutional review boards. Now, the common rule dictates how an institutional review board is set up. It states that IRBs must consist of at least 5 people and that IRB membership should be diverse. Now, diversity relates to personal characteristics like gender, race, and cultural backgrounds, but it also relates to areas of expertise. The board is required to be diverse in affiliations, with a requirement for at least 1 member whose focus is on non-scientific members and 1 member who's not affiliated with the institution. The diversity requirements are meant to ensure that the review of an IRB is not discriminatory towards any single profession or research area, and it promotes different viewpoints during the review. For example, consider the viewpoint of a medical professional dealing with cancer and a social scientist who focuses on race issues in the criminal justice system. Both of these individuals bring a unique perspective to the IRB review that may help them envision different risks and different benefits of the same research study. The 5-person membership requirement is pretty small, as most IRBs have a larger board membership. For example, UT Tyler IRB has 16 board members. These members include faculty from every college on campus, as well as administrators focusing on student issues, and also some community members. So what exactly is the role of the IRB in the research process? The IRB is in charge of analyzing a proposed research study before it begins. A researcher is going to put in a research proposal outlining to the IRB what they want to study and outlining all of their research design procedures. The IRB will then do a review of the study, looking in particular for those 3 major guidelines I just described. Does the study have procedures to ensure that participation is granted based on voluntary, informed consent? When the risks and benefits of the study are analyzed, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And 3, has the researcher taken steps to minimize the risk faced, and are subjects notified about potential risks when they enroll? The IRB will also look at the recruitment process and the distribution of subjects within a research study to ensure that it's fair and equitable to all subjects in all groups. Based on the type of study, IRB may review other procedures. For example, they may look at procedures that are put into place to protect the subjects participating in the research study. Protection of subjects means that the procedures ensure the safety of the participants, as well as procedures that protect the participants' identity and their private information from being released to the broader public. For example, if you were participating in a research study where you had to identify the type of illegal drug that you used in the past, you'd want to know that the information you discuss with researchers is being kept private and isn't being given to law enforcement. The IRB review into this type of study would look for procedures like removing your name from your answers or putting your answers into a locked and password-protected location to ensure that your answers are going to remain private. Most IRB protocols require that the information be kept in a secure location, which usually means a locked room or a password-protected file for that particular reason. IRB reviews will also examine the researcher's use of vulnerable subjects, as described by Parts B through D of the Federal Policy for Protection of Human Subjects. There are 3 different ways that a study can be reviewed by the IRB. The type of review is going to be influenced by the specific study characteristics. Exempt research means that it doesn't have to go through an IRB review at all. There are different reasons that a study is classified as exempt, but the most common in our field is that the research is being done in such a way that the research subjects are never identified and therefore face no loss of privacy risks. For instance, if you were to research using a data set that only contained numbers to identify people and it didn't include their name or any other identifiable information, then you would meet the requirements for exempt research. The exempt research proposal is relatively short, and it's usually only viewed by the chairperson of the IRB committee. Once they confirm that the research meets the requirements for exempt review, they'll notify the researcher and the research study can begin. FYI, the research studies that you complete in this course are considered exempt because they're done for classroom purposes only, and the information will not be published. So you don't have to go through IRB approval for any research activity in this course. You will need to do it if you're going to present at any outside conference, including the Lyceum. But I'll talk more about that as we go further. Now, expedited review requires IRB review, but it only requires a review by the IRB chairperson and potentially a few other members of the committee. Expedited research must not include a vulnerable population, as defined previously. it must not include more than minimal risk, and it must not include any form of deception. Full board review is the most extensive and the most time-consuming, and as you can see from this chart, also the least common type of review to occur. Full board reviews are required for any research that doesn't meet the requirement of exempt or expedited. Full board reviews mean that all of the IRB members in a particular institution must meet together to approve the study. When an IRB has concluded their review, they can make a decision to approve the study as is, they can require modifications, or they can reject the proposal outright. Usually proposals are only rejected if they have very obvious and very serious risks associated with the research design. Most proposals will be either approved as is or will require minor modifications, like changing the consent letter wording, modifying the recruitment procedures, etc. Again, the goal is not to stop research, but to ensure that the researcher has thoroughly considered all of the ethical guidelines for the study and has made provisions to eliminate or at least reduce the risk as much as possible to ensure the participant's safety and well-being. Every IRB is different, and procedures are going to vary based on the membership and the standard procedures used by that institution. When I was in Nebraska, our IRB was very formal, and it did not allow for visitors during the procedures. Instead, if they had questions as an IRB board, or if they wanted modifications, they would write the researcher a letter detailing their concerns. You would then have to create a letter in response, and then you would send it in with your revised IRB application for the next full board review meeting. The board only met twice a month, and with the back and forth process that this took, getting an IRB approved proposal could easily take 4 to 6 months at a time, if not longer. The IRB here at UT Tyler is much more flexible, and they meet as needed to review proposals, and they generally turn around research proposals within 4 to 6 weeks. Dr. Klein and I actually participated in a full board review of our research proposal here at UT Tyler. We were requesting to conduct a study that involved our research participants creating YouTube videos. There were several privacy concerns that made this higher than minimal risk, namely the fact that our subjects would be sending data electronically through an open website that would also include their names, faces, and identifiable information. So because of these privacy concerns, the chairperson of the IRB committee asked us to attend in person to answer questions, and they also invited a technology representative from our campus administration to answer questions about YouTube, data privacy, and other technology-related concerns. We sat in the meeting while they discussed the proposal, and we answered questions about our data procedures, and then we left when it was time for the committee to vote on the proposal. The IRB ended up approving our study, pending a few minor modifications to our forms, and we edited those and sent those over to the chairperson by herself for review. So a lot of the structure and the process of the IRB does depend on the composition and the procedures of your institution's IRB boards. When an IRB approves the study design, then the researcher is given the green light to proceed with the research. But that's not the end of the IRB's involvement in the research process. IRBs will also check in regularly with the researcher's progress. An IRB approval only lasts for a certain time period, typically 1 calendar year. At the end of that time period, the IRB will require the researcher to submit an annual report and to request continuation of the IRB approval if needed. The annual report allows the researcher to identify how the research is going and check in to make sure that the research is still using the approved study design. Researchers can also contact the IRB during the middle of a study if they need to file what we call a change of procedure or change of protocol. Sometimes, or oftentimes I should say, a research study requires some type of modification when it's actually being implemented. When this happens, the researchers file a change of protocol form with their IRB, asking for approval to modify the procedures. For example, my dissertation idea rose out of a larger study about sex offender policy that I started with one of the professors in my PhD program. Our plan was to send out a letter to all of the offenders who lived in all the people listed on the Nebraska State Sex Offender Registry, and that was about 3,300 people at the time. And we were inviting them to interview with us and to tell us how the sex offender laws had impacted their life. Given the reticence of most sex offenders to publicize their information, we expected, even though we sent out 3,300 invites, we only expected about 25 to 50 people. And our original IRB protocol listed 50 people as our total sample size. Little did we know that our invitation was going to go much better than we expected. I sent out the invites in the mail on Thursday morning, and by Friday, I had already received over 50 people calling me to request an interview. In all, we ended up getting about 300 people that requested to be interviewed. A lot of their stories were so unique then that we wanted to interview more than the 50 we had originally planned. So we filed a change of protocol form with the university's IRB and asked to interview more people. The picture here shows you a piece of the change of protocol form for the UT Tyler IRB. The modification request form includes 9 areas of potential change. These include changes in general study information, like the study title, research design modifications, changes in the research personnel, changes in potential risks, changes in the financial cost, changes to procedures involving human subjects, changes in the study population, changes in the study recruitment procedures, and they also have an other category for any other additional changes that don't fit into one of the above categories. For every change requested, the researcher must provide justification, and they must discuss how it affects the risk-benefit ratio of the study. Finally, researchers will also notify the IRB when their study ends. Most IRBs will request a final report detailing the total study outcomes as well. All right, well, that's the end of part 3. Join me in the last lecture of this module as we talk about the early stages of a research project.